William Faulkner once wrote, "For every Southern boy 14 years old, not once, but whenever he wants it, there is the instance when it's still not yet 2 o'clock on that July afternoon in 1863. The brigades are in position behind the rail fence. The guns are laid and ready in the woods, and the furled flags are already loosened to break out. And it's all in the balance. It hasn't happened yet. It hasn't even begun yet. It not only hasn't begun, there is still time for it not to begin. And yet it's going to begin. We all know that. We've come too far with too much at stake. And that moment doesn't even need a 14-year-old boy to think, this time, maybe this time."
My dear sister, it becomes my painful duty to inform you of Paul's death. Bear this with firmness, for sooner or later we all must die. I will return to Oxford, I suppose, and graduate in June, after which I must go hard to work. Goodbye, your brother Jerry. Jeremiah Gage, April 17, 1860.
When the Civil War ended in 1865, over 600,000 Americans were left dead. From Texas to Pennsylvania, from Kansas to South Carolina, the United States had spent 4 years tearing itself apart. But in the beginning, the idea of war gleamed with romance and glory. It was to be the great adventure. So it was for the students at the University of Mississippi. Students like Guston Kearney, a freshman from Vernon, Mississippi; Meshach Franklin, a recent graduate who returned to join his former schoolmates; and Jeremiah Gage, a law student from Holmes County, Mississippi, whose letters home would survive the war and forever lend a voice to a generation lost in tragedy. For these young men and their classmates, the journey would begin quietly enough in the fall of 1860 on a small college campus in Oxford, Mississippi.
The university was relatively small, less than 500 students. And the town of Oxford was also a small, sleepy Mississippi town of less than 1,500 to 2,000.
The students, sons of Mississippi's wealthy, demonstrated familiar traits of an all-male school.
The boys back then were just no different at all from boys today. Kids misbehaved in the dining hall. They threw food. They had food fights. They misbehaved every way you can think of in the dorms, from throwing things out of the windows to yelling at people. They'd make duck noises. They'd make mule noises. They'd make horse noises.
They, like modern-day students, like to imbibe whiskey. And although you couldn't get whiskey locally, they would bribe merchants who went to Memphis and brought back wagon loads of goods for their stores to purchase whiskey for them.
But for all their rough edges, for all their difficulty, and for all their undisciplined behavior, there was an intellectual side to them too. They were an interesting dichotomy, rough and tumble lads who enjoyed drinking and making mischief, and yet at the same time they were pretty smart.
Jeremiah Sanders Gage was in his final year of law school. The grandson of Irish immigrants, he was the first in his family to attend college.
He was a good student. He cut a few classes now and then, didn't make an A when he thought he should have. He wrote a letter home to his parents telling them, why he had a bad grade, why he had skipped chapel, that one of the professors was in a different fraternity and he had given some of the other boys better grades than Jerry got, and just such as that.
College has opened under very favorable circumstances. About 75 new students have registered today, and still they come. Of course, I have assumed my senior dignity, and the green freshmen look up to me as though I was some pumpkin. Jeremiah Gage, at Oxford.
The Chancellor of the University of Mississippi was a Northerner, Frederick Augustus Porter Barnard. A graduate of Yale, Barnard viewed the young university as a blank canvas on which he would paint one of the nation's finest institutions.
It was his dream to make the University of Mississippi one of the great universities in America.
But hanging heavy in the air was the talk of secession and war. In a speech on the Oxford Town Square, State Senator Jefferson Davis reassured the enthusiastic crowd that if presidential candidate Abraham Lincoln attempted to coerce Mississippi, the state would erect a gallows for him. The university students were hanging on every word.
I think the feeling in the South was that if Lincoln was elected, it meant war. And the boys were trying to decide what they were going to do if Lincoln was elected, if they were going to go fight or if they were going to stay in school.
Most of the students were the sons of Mississippi's plantation elite. Most of them opposed secession because they feared that secession would bring about war, and war would bring about the devastation of the Southern economy. But all of this changed after the firing on Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter was the galvanizing event that caused many people who were generally opposed to secession to become ardent secessionists, and that was certainly true on the campus.
Events began to move quickly, and the students were caught in the wildfire of war fever.
The town owned a cannon, and they kept it down on the square. The boys apparently sneaked into town that night, loaded the cannon with a double charge of powder, and set that cannon off on the town square. It broke out every single window on one side of the square and cracked many others.
The boys of the University of Mississippi would turn to a campus newcomer, William Benjamin Lowry. In just his first semester of attendance, he had quickly made a name for himself. He was a fighter with numerous demerits for drinking and brawling. Legend has it, he once rode his horse into the Lyceum in opposition to Chancellor Barnard. He had attended military academy before coming to Oxford, and it was this training, along with his fiery temperament, that drew classmates to him.
The boys looked up to him very quickly because he knew how to drill a company. He knew how to drill troops, which was fairly complicated, and that was his big step ahead of all those other boys.
Lowry was a charismatic young man and provided a great deal of emotional support for other students who were trying to make up their minds if they were going to support the Confederacy or not.
It was under the spell of this war-charged youth that a military company on campus was born. They would call themselves the University Grays.
Probably some of the boys were just gathered around in a bull session late at night in one of the dorm rooms around a fireplace, and just sitting around deciding what they were going to do in response to secession. And I think William B. Lowry said, let's start our own company, let's do something about this ourselves and stick together in this thing.
The University Grays were taking shape and form. They elected a captain. They began to arm themselves and began to literally form an organized military company. And these young men here at the university were almost mesmerized by this talk of war and the talk of forming a new country.
It became such a preoccupation with these boys that they began to neglect their studies, and the university administration had to constantly be putting the brakes on their fervor, trying to keep them in class.
Chancellor Barnard tried to stop them. He wrote letters to the boys' parents urging them to keep their sons out of the war. The reply shocked Barnard. Half the parents responded, not to prevent their sons from service, but to keep them out of the university grays.
They wanted their boy to come home and go to war with an uncle or a cousin or an older brother who could kind of keep an eye on that young boy. And they said, I don't want my boy in that hothead 17-year-old's company. Lowry's reputation had somewhat preceded him even to the parents. When Captain Lowry lost roughly half his company due to those letters, he had 33 men in his company. He was supposed to have a minimum of 49. Lowry went around to some of the law school boys and he said, look, I'm short on men. And he talked apparently Jeremiah Gage into joining the company then.
Chancellor Barnard realized that if the students went off to war, the university would inevitably close. And this he was dedicated to preventing. He wrote Governor John J. Pettus and encouraged him, implored him not to enroll the university grays in the state military. Actually, President Jefferson Davis supported Barnard's position. President Davis said, enrolling our young men into the military is like grinding the seed corn of the Republic.
For all his efforts, Frederick Barnard met with failure. The fate of his students was set. On April 26, 1861, they would be mustered into state service as Company A of the 11th Mississippi Infantry. 5 days later, they were aboard a train in Oxford, bound for Virginia.
As they boarded the train to go to Virginia, this is what they dreamed of. This is what Southern young men from the time of their boyhood dreamed of: military glory.
And how exciting it must have been, you know, how exciting, and what a good time they must have had. And you know, the girls lined the fences and waved their handkerchiefs, and truly in that first spring of the war, those young men were at the apogee of their lives, in the brightest moment of their lives. And it was a moment that would fade very quickly. But at least they had it, and not everybody gets it.
The day after the University Gray's departure, there were only 5 students left on campus. Barnard would leave Oxford and the university altogether, his dream destroyed. I am one whom the great rebellion has ruined, he wrote, and one whom, in the space of a few short months, it reduced to the condition of a homeless wanderer, without an object for which to live. As was the custom on campus, an autograph book was passed among the students earlier that year. The classmates would sign their name and leave their personal motto on the page. Calvin McCaleb, first lieutenant of the Grays, wrote, "Southern liberty or a Southern grave." Richard C. Bridges, a private in the company, left, "A cheerful face forever, a prosperous life, and a happy death." For his motto, William Lowry would write one word: woman. For the University Grays, the great adventure had begun.
Harper's Ferry, May 23, 1861. My dear Ma, we have been here some 4 days, everything moving smoothly on. Many think we may meet the enemy at any time. In my opinion, we will not fight soon, and if we do not fight by the 4th of July, I believe some proposals of peace will be made by the Federal Congress. What bothers some of us most is that we have left our girls behind us, but they will be rejoiced when we do come back. If we have a fight, you may expect to hear a good report from me and from our company. Affectionately, your son, Jerry.
The University Grays, along with the rest of the nation, would get their first taste of war on July 21, 1861, at Manassas, Virginia. Grays were sent to the left of the Confederate line and were given their assignment. They were to take the cannons on the Union right.
The moment of reality has arrived. How does a person do that? How does a person move forward under fire and take other people's, strangers' lives? First engagement is always the great epiphany for any soldier. But Manassas was the first great battle in the East, and the University Grays were right in the middle of it. A moment like that is a watershed in life, and the world could not be for them as it was before.
The Grays helped take Griffin's 2 guns and lost some boys doing it, one or two killed, probably a few wounded, but then they got counterattacked after they had taken the guns. We know that one got bayoneted there on the guns. They lost 2 or 3 other killed and probably 4 or 5 other wounded after being pushed off the guns. And they were finished for the day. It was over after that charge for them. They went to the rear, and that was all the fighting they did that day.
3 months earlier, when it seemed the Grays might not be called up for service, Second Lieutenant Levins Bislin sent an urgent letter to the governor of Mississippi. "For God's sakes, let us go," he wrote, "and I give you my word that you shall never blush for shame of the University Grays." 21-year-old Levins Bislin, a law student, would be among the first of his classmates to die.
When it came to killing other men, probably what happened there is what happens in war usually, is that the enemy becomes a faceless entity, and while you're doing it, it is meaningless. It is only afterward that the faces return. And I'll guarantee you that that night, wherever the University Grays were, there were a lot of bad dreams. A lot of bad dreams.
The next day after the battle, we know it rained. We have a reporter, and he said he went looking for the Grays the next day, and he found them in the rain, burying their dead and binding up their wounded.
The University Grays had passed their first test. It had claimed the lives of 7 of their friends, but it had also brought them the glory they had sought.
Captain Lowry and the Grays both received a good amount of press from their exploits at First Manassas, from helping take those guns, even though they couldn't hold them. They had newspaper articles written about them. They wrote their own letters home explaining to their parents and their girlfriends and their families what they'd done.
They did receive the accolades of their peers and the Board of Trustees in the fall of 1861, when they closed the university, made this statement that the University Grays, late of the University of Mississippi, have covered themselves in imperishable glory.
After the Confederate victory at Manassas, Lincoln called for 500,000 more volunteers for the Federal Army. The idea that the war would be short quickly faded, and both armies would move into winter quarters.
Camp Fisher, Virginia, January 2nd, 1862. My dear Ma, I have forgotten how long it has been since I wrote to you. I have been really homesick for about 2 weeks, for the first time since I left. I cannot realize that I have been from home 8 months, that a crop has been made and gathered, and that 1 year of my life has passed without my seeing cotton growing. On Christmas Day we had any quantity of eggnog, and I think about half the regiment was drunk. This is going to be a tight little war, I'm afraid, and the prospect is that it will last a long time. Write to me soon. I remain still your affectionate son, Jerry.
After First Manassas, it would be almost 10 months before the University Grays would see action again. But for all the boredom they had endured, waiting for their next fight, the year 1862 would cast them in the middle of 4 major battles. It would begin on May 31st at the Battle of Seven Pines.
At Seven Pines, they were ordered into a charge over what looked like a fairly grown-up grassy field, which was in fact a swamp, and it was 2 or 3 feet deep. And as they went charging into what they thought was a field, they quickly got mired down in the water, and they could not move fast enough to attack those guns, and they got repulsed.
That's where they really got into the bad stuff. And it was also the one in which many of the University Grays were wounded for the first time.
Captain Lowry was shot in the face at Seven Pines, and the ball entered his left cheek and cut across it right below the eye. The ball also took off the end of his nose and exposed his nostrils. Captain Lowry's wound seemed to make him even more erratic than he already was. He did miss a great deal of time away from the company. Probably made him a little meaner than he already was.
I am sitting by Lowry's bedside now. He has a horrid, ugly wound. I was in the Battle of the 31st, but came out safe. I had on my canteen and haversack, and a ball passed through them both and through my coat pocket. I had a newspaper, and the same ball that passed through my pocket shot a hole in my paper. I think I am destined to live the war through, having passed 2 big battles without even a wound. I think you need never feel uneasy. I must bid you goodbye. Your affectionate brother, Jerry Gage.
All told, the Grays would have 1 killed, 14 wounded at Seven Pines. The Confederate Army took over 6,000 casualties, among them its general, Joseph E. Johnston, whose critical wound forced him out of duty. With the Federal Army now within 9 miles of Richmond, the University Grays quickly found themselves under the command of a new general, Robert E. Lee. Within 4 weeks, though outnumbered, Lee would attack the Union forces at Gaines' Mill. The Grays would arrive at Gaines' Mill late in the day. Across the field, the Union Army held a superior position. 2 breastworks stretched across the side of a hill with artillery above them. Though Confederate attacks against the position had failed all day, the University Grays, along with the brigades of Generals Hood and Law, would make one more charge.
Their commanders told them, do not fire until you get right on top of the Yankees. They ran as quickly as they could down a hill without firing. They had to jump a ditch, and then when they got on the other side of the ditch, they stopped and they delivered their first volley into the first line of the Union soldiers. That broke that first line, and they turned around and ran back on the second line of Union soldiers who could not fire for fear of hitting their own men. That's how they routed the Union entrenched positions at Gaines' Mill.
The battle was a decisive Confederate victory, but not without cost. The University Grays would have 2 killed, 17 wounded.
By the time the charge was over and they had pushed the Yankees off the top of the hill and were able to then turn around and start picking up their wounded, it was nighttime. They said all over the hill that night you could hear men crying out, 4th Texas, 3rd Texas, here I am, where are you? Men calling out 11th Mississippi, come get me, come get me. And a lot of men, wounded men who could have been picked up and taken care of, died on the field.
Laying among the dead and dying was Jeremiah Gage. Wounded in the hip and unable to move, he would have to wait for rescue.
Jeremiah Gage laid on that field that night, and we don't know what time he was picked up. It could have possibly even been the next day. He's fortunate he didn't go into shock. He's fortunate he didn't bleed to death.
After spending 4 months in the hospital, Jeremiah Gage would return to Mississippi on wounded furlough.
When Jerry Gage went back to Oxford in 1862 on wounded furlough to see his girlfriend, it was a town of old men and women and little children.
It must have been a terrible shock, and that's silly to say, but that's the only way I know to say it. To step off the cars at that little depot there and walk up to the university and see it turned into a hospital.
He would have also have seen the burial field, the cemetery they had to start there from the men who died in the hospital.
I wonder if he looked around and thought about what they were doing, you know. Jerry Gage was a smart boy. He was a good boy. He was a good person. And he was intelligent and had a great deal of sensibility about him. And I just wonder if he thought, oh my God, you know, what have we done? What have we wrought here?
At the same time, the University Grays were marching into Maryland on their way north to find supplies for the Ragged Army.
During the Antietam campaign, the Confederate Army was at its lowest point as far as appearance and supplies and so forth. They were a bunch of hobos. They looked really ragged. The soldiers would have been full of lice and fleas, of course, and most of them would have had dysentery, and they were hungry all the time. The citizens of Maryland, you know, you read their accounts of the Confederate armies, and they're just shocked at these ragamuffins who are crossing the rivers, you know, and marching through their towns. These lean, dangerous, wolfish-looking men is the way they're described.
The Union Army rushed to stop Lee's advance. On September 17th, the two armies clashed in the town of Sharpsburg. In a battle that produced the single bloodiest day in American history. For their part, the University Grays found themselves fighting in what is now known as the cornfield.
In the mythology of the Civil War, we have these sacred places, these sacred groves, as it were, and certainly the cornfield at Antietam was one of these. You look at the progression of these battles. Say we lay them out on a scale of 1 to 10. First Manassas might have been a 1. Gaines Mill and Seven Pines, that might have been a 3. And then for Antietam or Sharpsburg, you jump all the way up to 15. I mean, there was no comparison in the scale and the scope and the horror and the bloodshed. When they went into Sharpsburg, there was nothing that they could compare that with. It was so awful. Those boys were making breakfast. Hood's men were making breakfast. They were called from their fires to make a counterattack. They were mad. They were hungry. They swarmed out into that field like angry bees.
The cornfield changed hands 5 or 6 times. The color bearer was lost, and the colors of the 11th Mississippi was lost in among the cannons at the top of the hill.
The 11th Mississippi lost its colonel, and they lost their colors. And those two things were, in the dynamics of a Civil War regiment, those were the two awfulest things that could happen, especially to lose the regimental colors.
The Grays started 1862, the active campaign season in the spring, with 80 men in the company, 80 men fit and present for duty. At Sharpsburg, they had roughly 20 men out of the 80 left in the company. Of those 20 men in the cornfield, 19 were killed or wounded. So from the beginning of 1862 with 80 men, they end up with 1 man standing. All the rest are dead or wounded.
Once again, the Grays went into winter quarters. Jeremiah Gage returned to his company to find it in shambles. Many of his friends were left unfit for combat and would be sent home. Among them, Lewis Taylor Fant, who lost a leg in the cornfield. The day after Christmas, awaiting his departure for home, Fant was on crutches when he tripped and fell, bursting an artery in his severed leg. The bleeding could not be stopped. Lewis Fant bled to death in 15 minutes.
War is a terrible thing. I hope another never comes during my lifetime. Jerry Gage.
The Battle of Sharpsburg left the Grays and their regiment with no commanding officers. As senior captain of the 11th Mississippi, William Lowry was to be promoted to colonel, but he was bypassed and Captain Francis Greene of Company G was given the position.
Captain Lowry had a problem with authority. He rode up one morning and found Greene, and he said, "Sir, what are you doing mustering my regiment?" And Greene looked at him and said, "Sir, this is my regiment." Lowry proceeded to have a real argument with him. Within a few hours, he had challenged him to a duel, and Greene had him arrested and had the captain who carried the challenge to him for the duel, or both arrested.
It would not have surprised me if Lowry had shot him down on the spot, you know. But I think when he was wounded, the ball plowed through his cheek and took off the end of his nose and terribly disfigured him. And I think that something psychologically happened to him. He had been standing very close to the edge anyway, and I think that disfigurement pushed him over.
Placed under arrest and demoted to officer's aide, 19-year-old Captain William Lowry would never command troops in the field again.
As this war progressed, Mississippi itself, the Magnolia State, would become a battleground. The soldiers from Mississippi who served in the Army in Northern Virginia, such as those in the 11th Mississippi, grew quite concerned about their loved ones at home. Their letters are full of comments. Questions are being asked about what's going on at home. How are my loved ones? It wore on these men tremendously.
Essentially what was happening was that the Yankees were swarming all over Mississippi, and these boys up in Virginia, they must have felt very frustrated at not being able to do anything about it.
I'm thinking if this plagued war will ever end, and why the deuce it even commenced. I dislike to hear you speak so discouragingly about war matters in Mississippi. I have no idea the Yankees will ever get to Vicksburg, or go down the Yazoo River. If they had our army to contend with, they would never have gone where they have. We are all nearly dead to get down there. I can see but one course we can pursue. We must whip them quickly and badly. It is the general impression that Lee contemplates a trip north to spend the summer, and you may bet on it that he will go through if he undertakes it, for he has the largest and finest army ever mustered. Goodbye, Jerry.
The soldiers of the Army in Northern Virginia, and the Mississippians included, are very confident that they are carrying this battle to the enemy.
Lee was desperate. He knew that he was losing a battle of attrition. But as the men crossed over the Potomac River, they were jubilant. They were yelling, hollering, screaming, you know, now we're going in to take the heart out of the enemy.
But on the way north, they marched through the battlefield of Chancellorsville that had been fought about 6 weeks before. The Grays had missed that battle. And one of the horrible things they saw wild hogs and even some wild dogs digging up the bodies on that battlefield.
By July 1st, 1863, the University Grays would find themselves in the rural Pennsylvania community known as Cashtown.
The company has reconstituted itself by getting the wounded men back, by bringing in men who'd been assigned to other details, by getting men out of prison camps, and they've built back up to about 31 men in the company.
Assigned to guard the supply wagons, the boys took advantage of a nearby creek, some bathing for the first time in weeks. 8 miles to the east, Union and Confederate forces met just outside of a small town. The Grays heard the first shots ring out. The Battle of Gettysburg had begun.
When you go to Gettysburg and you realize that you're standing in the geographical center of American history. I mean, that is the axis of American history. It runs right through that spot where Cushing's battery was.
July 2nd, they move in from Cashtown to right outside Gettysburg, all along Seminary Ridge. They're moved into the line.
On July 2nd, the University Grays would see no action, held in reserve on Seminary Ridge. Meanwhile, Lee's attempts to break the Union's flanks had been unsuccessful.
Thus, on July 3rd, he is going to throw his available troops directly at the center of the Union line. So the men of the University Grays, Company A, 11th Mississippi, will get their opportunity. Unfortunately for the Mississippians, they will be in the front rank, toward the left flank of the Confederate line. The only unit farther to their left is a brigade of Virginians under Colonel John Brockenbrough.
Ready! Hey! Fire!
In preparation for the attack, Lee ordered a massive artillery bombardment concentrated on the center of the Union line.
An hour comes and goes, and still the Union cannon that stand on Cemetery Ridge remain defiant, hurling shot and shell back toward the Confederates. The cannonade itself will last for 2 hours, but the Union shot, especially those that overshoot where the Confederate artillery is positioned, land among the Mississippians and the other Confederates who are lining up for the attack.
They're going to send us directly.
Well, you ready to give him the devil?
Yeah. I just don't want the devil to give it to me.
That was when Jerry Gage, of course, was wounded in that terrible artillery barrage there before the fight started.
Gage's good friend Jim Daly picked him up in the stretcher along with another man. They wrapped a tent shelter half around him, and then they carried him back to the aid station.
Jim. You bury me in my old shawl, Jim.
I will. I certainly will.
You bury me deep where the beast don't get me.
I will.
When he was wounded, he was taken to the rear to a field hospital.
Over here! Bring yourselves over here!
Where he languished in great pain.
Come on, let's have him here.
How much whiskey can you hold?
Why don't you take that on? Why, Doctor, that is nothing. This is where I'm really hurt. How long have I to live? Very few hours.
He had such great potential, but by the accident of history, a shell landed near him and ripped a gaping hole in his abdomen. He took time on his deathbed to remember why he was there, to remember what had brought him to this field, and it was family and home. He asked for a pen and paper.
Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, July 3rd. My dear mother, this is the last you may ever hear from me. I have time to tell you I died like a man. Bear my loss as best you can. Remember that I am true to my country, and my greatest regret in dying is that she is not free, and that you and my sisters are robbed of my word, whatever that may be. I hope this will reach you, and you must not regret that my body cannot be obtained. It is a mere matter of form, anyhow. This is for my sisters, too, as I cannot write more. Send my dying release to Miss Mary. You know who. J.S. Gage, Company A, 11th Mississippi. This letter is stained with my blood.
For a moment of pure poignancy and pathos, that moment, whatever its reality, that moment cannot be excelled, I think, in our record of personal lives of Confederate soldiers. What an extraordinary thing.
Well, it shows what a love of his country that he had, that his thoughts, even at dying, were for others. It's a really true Southern story. And you know what love of family. That's the main thing. It's all about family.
Within the hour, Jeremiah Gage would die. Jim Daly would later bury his friend's body in an unmarked grave on the fields of Gettysburg. And as was Jerry's request, he was buried in his shawl. The rest of his company, waiting in the woods, would soon meet with one of the greatest catastrophes in military history.
When the guns stopped, there was this space of silence, and imagine what it must have been like, and stillness, and then suddenly out of the woods comes this line of battle, just emerging from the woods with the bayonets fixed and the colors flying. There are records of what the Yankees saw, and they were stunned by the spectacle of it. The shining bayonets and men in perfect dress and maneuvering in the field and drums beating and flags and colors flying. For the last time in history, there was evidence of the terrible pageantry of war. And the 11th Mississippi was right in the middle of all that.
They walk through the smoke, and the smoke begins to dissipate, exposing the fields for all to see. Union artillerists up on Cemetery Hill will see the flank of Lee's line and open fire with solid shot and shell. Devastating casualties are inflicted upon the Confederate forces.
Joe Davis's brigade was next to the far left, and John Brockenbrough's brigade was on the far left. So whoever's on that far left, those are going to be the ones that will be exposed to cannon fire and rifle fire in the flank as well as in the front.
But as they continue across the field and come under the fire of Union infantry, the Virginians on the far left of the line will break and run to the rear.
Now this leaves the 11th Mississippi on the far left to take the fire from the flanks. And who is on the far left of the 11th Mississippi? Company A, University Grade.
They will take horrendous casualties from a murderous frontal fire of musketry, flank fire of artillery. Their ranks will thin. But with each man who falls, the man behind him moves up and takes his place in line. Lieutenant A.J. Baker of the University Grays will turn to the company commander, Captain John Moore, and say, "For God's sake, John, give the order to charge." Moore cannot do it. He doesn't have the fortitude to order his men forward into that murderous fire. He said, "I cannot do it." At which time Lieutenant Baker gives the command under his own authority, and the Mississippians race forward. The infantry opens fire, thousands of rifle muskets opening all at one time. In the large explosion of this fire, many witnesses, north and south, said a huge groan could be heard over the tumult of battle as this fire hits the Confederates. And in this tremendous explosion of smoke and flame, you could see heads and arms and other body parts just flying through the air.
But they continued the charge, as illustrated by the flag bearers of the 11th Mississippi. The original flag bearer was shot and killed just after they crossed Emmitsburg Road. Another soldier picked up the flag. He was killed. Another soldier picked up the flag to lead the charge. He was killed. A fourth flag bearer picked up the flag and led his men into the valley of the shadow of death, in the shadow of Bryan's barn, there at the stone wall at Gettysburg.
They gambled everything they had on that charge. Lee gambled everything he had and thought his men could do it, and yet they couldn't. That was Lee's mistake, and the boys in the Grays certainly paid for that mistake.
When they charged into the withering volley of musket fire at Gettysburg, someone wrote that they fell like leaves in an autumn wind. They littered the battlefield. As one general said, only the death angel could make such a scene as this. Every member of the University Grays in that epic charge at Gettysburg was either killed, wounded, or captured. 100% casualty. Such is the stuff from which imperishable glory is made.
After Gettysburg, the University Grays were combined with Company F and never carried more than 15 men on their roster for the remainder of the war. When Lee surrendered at Appomattox in April of 1865, only one University Gray, David Rogers, was present.
And meanwhile, Jerry Gage lies in an unmarked grave. All of his potential lost, all of his promise unfulfilled. Or maybe not. Maybe that's the way it was supposed to happen. Who knows? You know. Maybe he did what he was supposed to do. But every war has its lost generation. The generation that is obliterated, injured in their spirit and in their hearts. The world always loses when wars are fought. That's one of the reasons the South had to create that myth of itself, is to be able to deal with that. You know, the fact that so much was gone, there were so many ghosts and so many ruins, and the whole way of life had crumbled. And so you have to make it mythic to prove to yourself that it was worth it all.
Richard C. Lipsey of Lexington, Mississippi, joined the University Grays at the age of 18. He had grown up with Jeremiah Gage. In 1904, Lipsey wrote a letter to Confederate Veteran magazine, looking for his scattered friends. "I would like to see a reunion of the University Grays," he wrote. "I know there are but a few of them left. Then, we were all just boys." His letter would go unanswered. Richard C. Lipsey died in Holmes County in 1920, and the University Grays never once held a reunion.